In 1966, under this just immense, suffocating geopolitical pressure, the United States government initiated one of the most dangerous, devastating, and ultimately suppressed military experiments in modern history.
He really was.
Right. They drafted and sent 100,000 men with significant cognitive limitations. We're talking men with IQs between 70 and 80, directly into the dense, lethal jungles of Vietnam.
And, it wasn't a panicked act of desperation. That's the crazy part.
Exactly. It wasn't. It was this cold, calculated, algorithmic bet on system optimization. And it ended in an absolute systemic slaughter.
Yeah, this is the terrifying reality of what happens when a global superpower treats a brutal, asymmetrical war zone as basically a laboratory for human intelligence.
A meat grinder.
A literal meat grinder.
Right.
When you look at the raw data, the sheer human cost and the bureaucratic mechanisms that allowed this to happen, it just forces you to confront the absolute arrogance of institutional power.
It does.
I mean, it is a perfect dark mirror reflecting how vast structures, governments, militaries, massive corporations, how they actually view human life.
And that is exactly the framework we are using today.
Yeah.
For you listening, we are framing this deep dive not merely as a piece of forgotten military history, but as a blueprint.
A terrifying blueprint.
Right, of how modern institutions operate. This is fundamentally about the weaponization of data. It's about the devastating real-world consequences when complex, fragile human lives are reduced to spreadsheet metrics and output quotas.
Yeah, the human element is completely stripped away.
Completely. Today, we're dissecting the eternal debate of nature versus nurture, the incredibly dark and honestly, often deliberately hidden history of standardized testing and the neurobiological limits of the human mind under extreme life-or-death pressure.
It is a story of structural incentives and fatal hubris. I mean, it's about what happens when the people at the very apex of a hierarchy honestly believe that they can engineer their way out of a fundamentally chaotic, bloody reality using just mathematics and management theory.
Right. So let's anchor this in the geopolitical reality of the time. Take us to the epicenter of this decision.
Yeah.
Washington, D.C., 1966.
Okay.
The Cold War is at its absolute peak. What are the structural realities the United States military is facing at this exact moment?
Well, you have to understand the sheer scale of the crisis facing the American establishment in '66. The United States is locked in what they view as an existential struggle against the spread of communism.
The domino theory.
Exactly, the domino theory. That dictates foreign policy. This belief that if one nation falls to Soviet or Chinese influence, the surrounding nations will just inevitably follow. And Vietnam is the testing ground for this theory.
Right.
The U.S. is fighting North Vietnam, which is heavily backed by the USSR and China. They're funneling in weapons, logistics, strategic support, and the U.S. is pouring just unimaginable amounts of money, advanced weaponry, and human capital into this conflict.
And they're essentially just watching it all burn up in the jungle.
Yeah, they really are.
Because the warfare isn't playing out on an open battlefield in Europe, right? It's a completely different paradigm.
Exactly. I mean, the enemy tactics in the dense jungles of Vietnam are completely evading traditional military rules of engagement. The U.S. military was built to fight the Soviets on the plains of Europe. Tanks, clear front lines, massive artillery barrages.
Predictable logistics.
Right, highly predictable. But in Vietnam, it's asymmetrical guerrilla warfare. You have to imagine the reports coming back to Washington from the field commanders. It's just a steady stream of constant, agonizing frustration.
What were they saying?
The soldiers are reporting things like, we can't even see the enemy. Ambushes, booby traps, invisible supply lines like the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The conventional rules of warfare simply aren't working.
Wow.
The entire endeavor, which was supposed to showcase American supreme military dominance, is rapidly slipping through their fingers. The casualty rates are climbing, the draft is becoming deeply unpopular back home, and the domestic political pressure on the Johnson administration is just reaching a boiling point.
And all of these reports, all of this chaotic, terrifying data from the jungle, it's all funneling back to one specific place. It's reaching one man sitting in the Pentagon staring at the numbers. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara.
Yes, Robert McNamara. And to understand the architecture of this disaster, you really have to deeply understand McNamara's background.
Who was he?
Well, he was not a war hero. He wasn't some battle-hardened general who had spent his life in the trenches understanding the muddy, unpredictable, visceral reality of combat. McNamara came from the corporate world.
Okay.
Specifically, he was a former senior leader at Ford Motor Company. He was one of the famous whiz kids, this group of 10 veterans from World War II who had served in the Army Air Force's Statistical Control Office.
Wait, statistical control. So his military background was purely logistical and statistical.
Purely. I mean, during the Second World War, these men didn't fly bombers. They calculated the precise amount of fuel, ammunition, and loss rates to optimize the bombing campaign.
Just number crunching.
Exactly. And after the war, Henry Ford II hired the entire group of them to save Ford Motor Company, which was hemorrhaging money at the time. McNamara and the whiz kids applied strict statistical control.
What does that mean in practice?
They tracked every nut, every bolt, every man-hour. They ruthlessly optimized the supply chains. They didn't care about the passion of building cars. They cared about the metrics.
Right.
They turned Ford around and made it massively profitable. McNamara was, at his core, a systems optimizer.
So he's a factory guy. His entire worldview, his fundamental definition of success, was built on an industrial floor.
That is the crucial psychological profile here. It was all about supply chains, measuring inputs and outputs, and eliminating inefficiencies. When he looked at a factory floor, he saw a system that could be continuously tweaked for maximum output.
And tragically, when he looked at the jungles of Vietnam, he saw the exact same thing.
He did. He didn't view war as a clash of human will or a psychological endurance test or a chaotic environment of terror and heroics. He saw it purely as an industrial factory output problem.
That is so dark.
It really is. The body count was just a metric to him. He fundamentally believed that wars are won by the most efficient optimization of resources, not by the smartest or bravest soldiers.
So he is sitting in the Pentagon, optimizing his spreadsheets, but the reality on the ground is catastrophic. And he's facing a severe manpower shortage and two incredibly bad options.
Right.
On one hand, he could look at the data, realize the strategy's fundamentally flawed, halt the escalation, and pull out. But we know the political reality of 1966. Doing that is political suicide for the administration.
Oh, absolutely.
It means an admission of defeat, a massive stain on America's global reputation during the Cold War, and obviously the end of his career as the architect of American defense.
Which, for a man driven entirely by metrics and relentless success is an unacceptable output. He literally cannot compute failure.
So the first option is off the table. The second option is to make a chilling moral compromise. To keep feeding the war machine, he needs more bodies.
He needs inputs.
Right, inputs. The draft pool of eligible, physically and mentally fit men is running dry, largely due to college deferments for the wealthy and middle class. So he decides to fundamentally alter the input. He decides to lower the military selection criteria.
And this is where we have to look at the historical precedent he was violating. The U.S. military wasn't operating in the dark regarding intelligence and combat effectiveness.
He knew better.
They absolutely knew better. They had learned very hard, very clear lessons from World War II. They had vast data sets proving definitively that high IQ soldiers, the pilots, the engineers, the artillery officers, had a massive survival advantage.
Because war is an infinitely high-pressure environment that demands rapid, complex decision-making.
Yes. High cognitive ability was a proven, undeniable lifesaver. Because of this, the military had instituted strict baseline rules. Anyone who scored in categories the 5th and V on the Armed Forces qualification test was strictly barred from combat deployment.
Let's clarify that for everyone listening. The Armed Forces Qualification Test, or AFQT, categorizes recruits. Categories 4V and V correlate roughly to an IQ between 70 and 80.
Correct.
So we are talking about individuals with significant cognitive limitations. These might be people with undiagnosed learning disabilities, poor adaptability, or simply individuals who process multi-step information much, much slower than the average person.
Right.
These are the exact people the military had previously looked at and said it is physically and structurally too dangerous for them, and it is too dangerous for the men serving alongside them to put them in a live combat zone.
Exactly. It was a rule written in the blood of previous conflicts. I mean, it wasn't about discrimination. It was purely about battlefield survivability. But McNamara, under the crushing pressure of the Vietnam quagmire and his desperate need for more inputs to his war machine, simply reversed it.
Just like that.
With a stroke of a pen, he wiped that protective rule away.
Yet it sounds like he wasn't looking at them as soldiers who needed to survive. He was looking at them like teenagers working a fast food drive-thru.
That's a great way to put it.
You don't need the teenager to know how to butcher a cow or understand supply-side economics. You just need them to press the button when the fries are done.
That analogy is frighteningly accurate to how McNamara conceptualized this structurally. I mean, McNamara essentially believed he could run the United States military operations in Vietnam The same way you run a highly centralized franchise.
Like in McDonald's.
Literally like a McDonald's. Think about the architecture of a fast food chain. The system is meticulously designed so that someone with absolutely no prior culinary knowledge, maybe operating at a slower cognitive pace, can walk in on their first day and produce a perfectly standardized burger.
Right, because all the friction has been removed.
Exactly. How is that possible? Because the intelligence of the entire operation is completely centralized in the corporate headquarters. The frontline worker doesn't need to understand flavor profiles. They just need to rigidly follow the SOPs, the standard operating procedures.
The thinking's already been done for them. The system absorbs the intellectual burden.
Precisely. And McNamara applied this exact industrial model to jungle warfare. He believed that the high IQ officers, the commanders, would act as the brains of the operation. They would be the centralized strategic decision makers.
And the recruits.
The low IQ soldiers drafted under this new policy would merely be the hands. Their job wasn't to think or adapt to changing circumstances or analyze the chaotic terrain. Their job was simply to execute simple, repetitive, standard operating procedures on the battlefield.
Just follow the steps.
Yeah. When X happens, pull Y trigger. The brain gives the command, the hands execute the drill.
Okay, but we have to pause here because the sheer detachment of this is staggering. It's one thing to have this incredibly clinical, almost sociopathic spreadsheet logic in the privacy of the Pentagon.
Sure.
But we were talking about a democracy in the 1960s. How does he actually sell this to the American public? I mean, you can't just stand at a podium in Washington and tell a nation, hey, the draft pool is low, so we're going to send your cognitively vulnerable sons to be cannon fodder because I believe I can optimize them like fry cooks.
Oh, there would be riots in the streets instantly.
Exactly.
Right, so the optics of the naked truth are politically impossible. So McNamara and his public relations apparatus did something incredibly insidious. They wrapped this cold industrial calculation in the warm, progressive language of social upliftment.
They spun it as a good thing.
They did. And this is where the weaponization of science comes into play. In 1964, just 2 years prior to this policy change, a brilliant neuroscientist named Marion Diamond conducted a groundbreaking experiment at UC Berkeley.
What did she do?
She placed rats in highly stimulating, challenging, enriched environments, mazes with toys, social interaction, constant novel challenges, and what she discovered was revolutionary. The cerebral cortices of these rats actually grew thicker.
Wow.
Yeah, and the cerebral cortex is a core neurobiological regulator of intelligence and processing speed.
So she essentially proved neuroplasticity.
Huh.
She proved that the brain isn't just a static rock. It can adapt, change, and physically grow in response to its environment.
Yes, it was a beautiful scientific discovery about the power of nurturing environments. But McNamara took this laboratory study on rats and twisted it into military propaganda.
How so?
He stood before the public and argued that drafting these low IQ men from impoverished backgrounds wasn't an act of desperation. He framed it as a benevolent, great society social program.
You're kidding.
No, he claimed that the extreme, intense challenge of the battlefield, combined with the rigorous structure of military discipline, would act as an enriched environment. He stated that this would literally force these men's brains to evolve.
That is insane.
He promised the American public that the war would raise their IQs, teach them trades, cure them of poverty, and dramatically improve their post-war lives.
He branded it as an opportunity. He called it Project 100,000. And it is just breathtakingly cynical to take a scientific discovery about the benefits of a nurturing, safe, intellectually stimulating environment and use it to justify dropping vulnerable men into a literal meat grinder where people are shooting at them.
It is the ultimate perversion of science for institutional gain.
But to truly understand McNamara's clinical detachment, how a government official could even conceptualize human beings as permanent numerical categories to be shifted around a board, we have to pull back.
We do.
We have to look at the deeply political and frankly disturbing history of intelligence testing itself. Because McNamara didn't invent the idea of treating people as numbers. He inherited a system that had been doing it for decades.
Absolutely. He didn't invent the concept. He merely industrialized an idea that had been festering in the Western intellectual consciousness for nearly a century.
Let's trace this back. Where does the institutional obsession with tracking, measuring, and numbering human intelligence actually begin?
We have to travel back to Victorian England around the year 1880. We meet a man named Francis Galton. Now, Galton was a polymath, and significantly, he was Charles Darwin's half-cousin.
Really? Darwin's cousin?
Yep. And he was absolutely obsessed with the concept of nature versus nurture. But Galton wasn't just a curious objective scientist. He was a wealthy aristocrat, harboring a deep, pervasive societal paranoia that was actually very common among the elite of his time.
What was he afraid of?
He firmly believed that intelligence, morality, and capability were strictly genetic, hard-coded, locked permanently in the bloodline.
So his fear, looking at the changing world around him, was what exactly?
His fear was demographic and genetic collapse. He looked at the poorer classes, the working classes who were reproducing at a higher rate than the educated elite, and he introduced this creeping paranoia into the Western intellectual sphere.
Right.
His argument was, if intelligence is fixed, and if the low IQ individuals outbreed the high IQ individuals, society will eventually and inevitably collapse under the weight of its own incompetence.
Wow.
He called it regression toward mediocrity. He didn't have rigorous genetic data for this. He had elite anxiety masked as biology, but it planted a very dangerous seed. It created the idea that human value is a biological hierarchy.
Fast forward 25 years. It's 1905 in Paris. Two psychologists, Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon, are commissioned by the French government to invent the first actual intelligence test.
Right.
They are having children track moving objects with their eyes, recognize visual patterns, perform basic memory tasks. But here is the absolutely crucial point that gets deliberately erased by later institutions. Binet explicitly stated that intelligence is not a fixed quantity.
Yes, this is the great tragedy of Binet's legacy. His intent was entirely benevolent. He designed this test purely as a diagnostic tool for the French school system.
Not a ranking system.
Exactly. The goal was simple. Identify young children who were struggling to learn in standard classrooms so that teachers could provide them with extra academic help, specialized resources, and tutoring.
You wanted to help them.
He was terrified of his test being used as a permanent limiting label. He practically begged people not to use it to rank children's inherent worth. He actually believed intelligence could be shaped by education.
But then the tool crosses the Atlantic. And we see the American perversion of Binet's helpful diagnostic tool. It's 1916, the era of the First World War.
Yep.
The U.S. is preparing to enter a massive global conflict, and suddenly the military needs to sort millions of drafted soldiers incredibly fast.
Yeah.
They need to figure out who is an officer, who is infantry, who is a cook. Enter two American psychologists, Henry Goddard and Louis Terman.
And this is where the psychological tool becomes a weapon. Terman, who was a psychologist at Stanford University, takes Binet's nuanced, empathetic tool and completely strips it of its original intent.
He weaponizes it.
He twists it into a permanent genetic labeling machine. Terman adapts the test and invents what we now know as the Stanford-Binet IQ test. And in doing so, he achieves something that massive institutions absolutely crave.
What's that?
He reduced the vast, incalculable, fluid complexity of human intellect into a single, hard, predictable number.
Because if you think about how large systems operate, institutions love a number. A number mitigates risk. A number gives a bureaucrat the illusion of total control over a chaotic population.
Precisely. If you have a number, you don't have to get to know the person. You can sort. You can categorize. You can predict their economic output. And Henry Goddard, a prominent psychologist of the era, took it a step further.
What did he do?
He needed clinical, scientific-sounding language to define these new numerical categories. He wanted to classify the people who scored on the lower end of the Stanford-Binet, so he literally invented the word moron.
Wait, moron wasn't just a generic playground insult?
Not at all. He derived it from the Greek word moros, meaning foolish or dull. It was introduced as a legitimate, scientific, clinical category.
You've got to be kidding.
I'm serious. If you scored in a certain bracket, you were officially medically diagnosed as a moron. Words like imbecile and feeble-minded were also codified as permanent scientific classifications for human beings based entirely on this single test score.
Wait, so the infrastructure of the country is failing because of massive immigration, rapid industrialization, and urbanization. The cities are crowded, the plumbing is bad, the schools are packed, but instead of fixing the roads and building hospitals, which is expensive and difficult, they just blame the people failing these newly invented tests.
You've hit the exact mechanism. To understand how a tool meant to help struggling Parisian school children leaps from the classroom into brutal government policy, you have to look at the macroeconomic conditions of the United States in the 1910s and 1920s.
Okay, set the scene.
The welfare systems, the state-run asylums, the state budgets, they were overflowing. The infrastructure of the country simply could not handle the rapid demographic changes of the Industrial Revolution and mass immigration through Ellis Island. The system was failing structurally.
And fixing a failing structural system requires massive capital investment. It requires housing reform, educational overhauls, labor laws. It requires taxing the wealthy to build infrastructure.
Exactly. It's hard, expensive, politically perilous work. But politicians and institutional leaders rarely choose the hard, complex fix when a simple psychological strategy is available. And that psychological strategy is systemic scapegoating.
Let's really drill down into that. How does systemic scapegoating function at a state level?
Systemic scapegoating occurs when you take a vast, abstract structural failure, like a collapsing economy or an overwhelmed healthcare system, and you pin the blame entirely on a visible, vulnerable subgroup of the population.
You give people an enemy.
You give the frustrated public a face to hate instead of a complex system to critique. Think of authoritarian regimes. Think of Hitler scapegoating the Jewish population for Germany's staggering economic hyperinflation and military humiliation after World War I.
Right.
Or Stalin scapegoating the kulaks, the slightly wealthier peasant farmers, for the massive, devastating famines caused directly by his own disastrous agricultural collectivization policies.
You find a target who can't fight back.
You find a target. And in the 1920s, the U.S. government, heavily influenced by the intellectual elite like Terman and Goddard, decided to blame the overwhelming burden of the welfare and asylum systems not on poor infrastructure or lack of funding, but on low IQ individuals.
Unbelievable.
They pointed to the Stanford Binet scores, pointed to Goddard's clinical categories of morons and feeble-minded, and basically said to the public, these people are the reason our state budgets are collapsing.
You made them the villains.
Yes. They argued that their inherent genetic inferiority, their inability to adapt to modern industrial life, is a permanent drain on the state. They called them a parasitic weight on our progress.
And this incredibly toxic ideology births the eugenics movement. It transitions from an elite social prejudice into the actual law of the land. We have to talk about the 1927 Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell.
Yeah, we do.
Because this is the horrifying moment the state legally weaponizes the IQ test against the bodily autonomy of its own citizens.
Buck v. Bell is, without question, one of the most chilling and shameful Supreme Court decisions in American history. It centered on a young woman named Carrie Buck. She lived in Virginia.
What happened to her?
Carrie had been raped by a relative of her foster family. To hide the family's shame, she was committed to a state institution for the feeble-minded. The state of Virginia, operating under these new eugenic laws, wanted to forcefully sterilize her so she couldn't reproduce.
Based on what argument?
They argued that her perceived low intelligence and quote-unquote immorality were genetic. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the verdict, an 8-1 decision, was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., one of the most celebrated legal minds in American history.
What did he write?
He wrote that society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind, comparing it to mandatory vaccinations, and he ended his legal justification with a line that still echoes as a warning today. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough.
3 generations of imbeciles are enough. The highest court in the United States, giving the absolute legal green light for state-sponsored mutilation based on a flawed intelligence test. And the result of that ruling: over 70,000 Americans were forcefully sterilized by their own government over the following decades.
And we have to be absolutely clear about the global context here. This wasn't just an isolated American phenomenon. This was a global technocratic obsession. The desire for cold, calculated system optimization swept through the entire developed world.
Give me some examples.
Nazi Germany, taking direct and explicit inspiration from the American eugenics movement and Buck v. Bell, sterilized roughly 400,000 people before moving on to extermination.
Jesus.
But it wasn't just totalitarian fascist regimes. Social democracies did it too, under the guise of public health. Sweden sterilized 60,000 of its citizens. Denmark sterilized 11,000, all in the name of optimizing the societal system by eradicating the unfit and lowering the burden on the welfare state.
So when we take this incredibly dark history and connect it back to 1966 and Robert McNamara, it paints a terrifying picture. McNamara absorbed this pervasive global eugenics premise.
He fully internalized it.
He accepted the foundational idea established by Galton, Terman, and Holmes that low IQ people are a fundamentally separate, lesser category of human being, a quantifiable, expendable resource. But instead of sterilizing them to save the welfare budget, he decided to industrialize them to save his war effort. He viewed them as raw material.
That is exactly right. Raw material for the factory of war.
Before we move into the devastating reality of what actually happened when these men hit the battlefield, I want to pause. If you value these deep, unvarnished looks into the structural forces and hidden histories that shape our world, make sure you hit subscribe. We rely on listeners like you to keep dissecting these historical blueprints.
It's important history to keep alive.
It really is.
Yeah.
Right. Let's look at the data. Let's get into the jungle. What was the reality of Project 100,000? What happens when McNamara's fast food franchise model of war meets the Viet Cong?
The reality was an unmitigated catastrophe. For years, the government actively tried to hide the data, maintaining the public illusion that the program was a resounding success of social engineering.
But the truth came out.
It did eventually, largely through the leaking of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 and subsequent demographic tracking. And the data revealed a systemic slaughter. Low IQ soldiers drafted under Project 100,000 died at 3 times the normal rate of average soldiers.
3 times the death rate.
3 times. And the psychological toll was even worse. Rates of severe mental trauma, psychiatric breakdowns, and crippling PTSD were 3 to 5 times higher among this specific cohort.
Wow.
But perhaps the most damning statistic regarding McNamara's structural theory of war, the idea that these men could just act as the hands and follow centralized orders, was that incidents of friendly fire doubled in units with high concentrations of Project 100,000 soldiers.
Friendly fire doubled, meaning they were shooting their own guys. Let's talk about the symptoms on the ground, because the historical reports from platoon leaders are absolutely harrowing.
They are tough to read.
You read these accounts, and it's a litany of terrifying cognitive collapse. Soldiers literally freezing in place, completely catatonic upon making eye contact with the enemy. Men in a panic loading the same rifle 3 times until it jammed completely. Guys putting 2 left boots on in the dark and trying to march.
Yeah.
Medical staff, because remember, they drafted medical personnel into these lowered criteria to performing surgeries or administering drugs to the wrong parts of the body.
Right.
But I have to push back here. Were they just fundamentally incapable of following the rules? Because McNamara's entire justification was that they didn't need to be smart, they just needed to follow the standard operating procedures.
Yeah.
If A happens, do B. Were they just inherently insubordinate or untrainable?
No, and that is the most tragic, heartbreaking part of this entire experiment. They weren't insubordinate at all. They really wanted to do a good job. In fact, during basic training back in the United States, in the highly controlled, predictable environment of a military base, they followed the rules perfectly. Oh, yeah. They could march in formation. They could meticulously clean their rifles. They could recite the SOPs perfectly. The failure in the jungle was not a failure of discipline, and it wasn't a refusal to follow rules.
What was it?
It was a pure, inescapable neurobiological bottleneck occurring under extreme, life-threatening stress.
Okay, we need to break that down completely. What is actually happening in the physical brain when these men hit the jungle?
To understand this mechanism, we have to look at what cognitive neuroscientists call fluid intelligence. The ultimate metric of fluid intelligence is often measured by something called the Raven's progressive matrices.
What is that?
It's a visual test where you look at a sequence of abstract shapes and patterns that are missing a piece, and you have to logically deduce what comes next. It doesn't test what you've memorized. It doesn't care if you know the capital of France. It tests how your brain organizes unknown, chaotic, novel information in real time.
Right, so it's not about the data stored on your hard drive. It's about the speed of your processor when encountering something completely new.
Exactly. And brain processing in these high-stakes, chaotic environments, like a jungle ambush, happens in 3 distinct neurobiological steps.
Walk me through them.
Step 1 is simply visual processing.
Yeah.
Everyone, regardless of whether their IQ is 75 or 140, sees the battlefield equally. The photons hit the retina, the eyes take in the shapes of the trees, the flashes of gunfire, the movement of the enemy. There is no cognitive difference in the raw intake of visual data.
But step 2 is where the hardware limitations start to show.
Yes. Step 2 is pattern relations. I like to call this the dimensional playground of the brain. The raw visual information moves from the occipital lobe into the parietal cortex, which is responsible for spatial awareness.
Okay, spatial awareness.
Right, and the parietal cortex then has to communicate back and forth at lightning speed with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the DLPFC, which handles executive function. Together, these brain regions form the frontoparietal network.
Okay, let's ground that jargon. What is the frontoparietal network actually doing for a soldier in a firefight?
Think of it exactly like your computer's RAM your working memory. When you are trying to solve a dynamic problem, Your working memory is holding the different competing variables in your conscious mind simultaneously so you can compare them and make a decision.
Okay, that makes sense.
A statistically average brain, due to the density and efficiency of the white matter tracks connecting these regions, can hold about 3 to 4 complex variables in its working memory at once.
And the low IQ recruits.
A low IQ brain, which often has less dense connective white matter in this specific network, can typically only hold 2 to 3 variables at once.
So the RAM capacity is physically smaller. The biological capability to hold multiple competing facts at the exact same moment is constrained by the hardware.
Precisely. It is a structural limitation. Now, assuming you've managed to hold those variables, we move to step 3. Rule testing.
Row testing.
Your brain has to take those variables and figure out what action to take. The anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, acts like a brutal internal editor. It quickly runs simulations, identifies bad ideas or incorrect rules, and kills them before you act on them.
Yeah.
At the exact same time, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex acts like a bouncer at an exclusive club.
Give me an everyday example of that bouncer at work before we put it in a war zone.
Sure. Think about the last time you were driving on a highway at night and suddenly a massive torrential rainstorm hits. What is the first thing you unconsciously do? You reach over and turn the car radio down.
Yes, exactly. You turn down the volume so you can quote-unquote see better.
Right. That is your ventrolateral prefrontal cortex at work. It recognizes that the cognitive load is too high, so the bouncer blocks out the irrelevant auditory noise, the music, so all your processing power can focus on the actual threat, which is the road. Its job is to block distraction.
Okay, let's take this neurobiology out of the car, out of the lab, and put it into the jungles of Vietnam. Imagine you were a 19-year-old drafted into Project 100,000. Paint the picture of the crash. What does this biological bottleneck look like in reality?
Imagine you are that soldier. You're on patrol. Suddenly an ambush is triggered. You have exactly 10 seconds to make a decision that will dictate whether you live or die. Here is the raw data hitting your brain simultaneously.
Let's hear it.
1. Heavy automatic gunfire is erupting from the tree line on your left side. 2. The terrain on your right side is uneven, thick mud and roots, meaning you cannot physically sprint that way to escape. 3. The radio strapped to your platoon leader's chest is screaming conflicting artillery coordinates.
Oh, man.
4. There is thick, acrid green smoke billowing directly ahead, completely obscuring your line of sight. 5. A teammate goes down screaming in agony 2 yards away. 6. You know from muscle memory that you only have half a magazine of ammunition left in your rifle.
That is terrifying. That's 6 massive, dynamic, life-threatening variables hitting the brain in a fraction of a second.
Now, let's look at how the two different biological systems process this chaos. A high IQ brain, the brain that McNamara assumed could just manage the situation and give orders, does something cognitive scientists call chunking.
Chunking.
It takes those 6 variables and synthesizes them into 3 manageable structural concepts. For example, it takes the gunfire on the left, the blinding smoke ahead, and the wounded teammate, and the brain rapidly groups them together. It labels that entire chunk enemy pressure zone.
So it simplifies it.
Exactly. It takes the uneven, muddy terrain on the right and the low ammo count and chunks that into movement and resource constraint. It takes the screaming radio commands and chunks it into evac timeline.
So now we have 3 chunks.
3 chunks. Enemy zone, movement constraint, evac timeline. That fits perfectly into the 3 to 4 variable capacity of normal working memory RAM. The brain instantly organizes the chaos, the anterior cingulate cortex selects a survival rule, and the soldier acts. He throws a grenade left and retreats right.
But what happens to the soldier from Project 100,000? What happens to the low IQ brain with a working memory capacity of only 2 to 3 variables when it is hit with 6?
It attempts to process the data serially, one by one. It tries to look at the gunfire, then the mud, then the radio, then the smoke. It cannot chunk them fast enough.
The RAM is instantly, violently overloaded.
And when the human brain overloads, it doesn't just slow down, it crashes. It locks onto just one single variable to try and survive. And it usually locks onto the loudest, most primal, most terrifying stimulus, which is the gunfire.
So everything else just drops.
Everything else, the muddy terrain, the radio commands, the ammo count, and crucially, all those standard operating procedures they flawlessly learned in training camp is completely dropped from working memory. It is wiped from the RAM.
What does that look like on the outside?
Total systemic failure. The soldier freezes in place, completely catatonic. Or he fires blindly into the smoke, hitting his own men. Or he literally turns and runs the wrong way into the line of fire.
It's a biological system crash. It's the blue screen of death, but in a jungle where people are trying to kill you.
Yes. But here is the ultimate physiological mechanism that makes this a complete tragedy. This is the factor that McNamara's sterile corporate modeling completely fatally ignored: the stress penalty.
The stress penalty.
Extreme high-stakes stress, the visceral primal fear for your own life, causes the adrenal glands to release a massive immediate flood of cortisol and adrenaline into the brain. This chemical flood physically disrupts the frontoparietal network. It literally shrinks working memory capacity by 40 to 50% in everyone.
Wait, in everyone, even the smartest, most experienced generals.
Absolutely everyone. Stress makes every single human being stupider in the moment. It degrades cognitive function across the board. But it's all about where your baseline starts. If your baseline working memory is very high, say you are a highly intelligent officer who can normally juggle 5 or 6 complex variables, and the stress of an ambush cuts your capacity down by 50%, you can still hold 2 or 3 variables. You are cognitively diminished, yes, but you remain functional. You can still process enough data to survive.
But if your baseline is already only 2 or 3 variables on a calm day.
Exactly. If your baseline RAM is 2 or 3 variables, a 50% drop puts your working memory at near zero. The brain literally blanks. It reboots to pure, unthinking reptilian instinct.
It's devastating.
McNamara assumed you could train a man like a machine, completely ignoring the physiological reality that intense terror alters human biology. You cannot optimize a terrified human being like a factory part. When the cortisol hits, the spreadsheet burns.
Let's follow this out. Let's move to the aftermath of this disaster, because McNamara made a very specific public promise to the American people.
He did.
He leaned on Marion Diamond's rat study to promise that the immense stress of war, the enriched environment of military discipline, would thicken their cerebral cortices. He promised it would make them smarter. Did it? We have the data now. Did the surviving soldiers' IQs go up?
We have extensive multi-decade data. The military tracked these men for decades after the war ended. The answer is a definitive, tragic no. There was zero increase in IQ. The environmental stress of a war zone did not magically evolve their brains, it shattered them.
And their lives post-war, how did they fare back in civilian society?
Catastrophically, the data is heartbreaking. Compared to peers of similar socioeconomic backgrounds, similar baseline intelligence, who were not drafted into Project 100,000, the survivors of this program had significantly worse outcomes across every conceivable metric.
Like what?
They had much lower employment rates. They suffered from severe PTSD at astronomical rates, which further degraded their cognitive abilities. Substance abuse was rampant, and their lifetime earnings were actually net negative compared to their non-drafted peers.
It's just a complete betrayal.
The system consumed them as raw material, broke them in a hostile environment, and then discarded them. Furthermore, many were denied military pensions or adequate veteran benefits because the military bureaucratic machine, the same machine that drafted them, ultimately discharged them under less than honorable conditions or labeled them as defective when they inevitably failed to adapt to the trauma.
Just to avoid paying them.
Pretty much. Hamilton Gregory, who served in Vietnam and witnessed this firsthand, wrote a brilliant, heartbreaking book about this called McNamara's Folly. He details how completely, systematically, the government abandoned these men once their utility as cannon fodder was exhausted.
So, taking all of this in, I have a massive philosophical challenge for you based on everything we've just discussed.
Okay, I'm ready.
If the brutal, unforgiving reality of the battlefield proved that low IQ is, in fact, a fatal limitation under pressure, does that mean the early eugenicists, guys like Francis Galton and Louis Terman, were actually right in their core assumption? Is IQ the ultimate, hard-coded ceiling on human potential? Or are we purely defined by this single processing speed number?
That is the ultimate question of this entire deep dive, and this is where the narrative takes a fascinating, optimistic twist. The data tells us something highly nuanced. IQ is incredibly crucial up to a very specific point.
Okay.
It is a necessary baseline for handling complex systems, but it has a hard, definitive limit. It is not the ultimate measure of human value, and it is certainly not the ultimate predictor of world-shaping success.
Okay, prove it. How do we know that?
Let's look at Louis Terman himself, the very guy who invented the Stanford-Binet test and turned IQ into a fixed, defining label. In 1921, Terman was so arrogantly confident in his metric that he started a massive, unprecedented longitudinal study at Stanford.
What did you do?
He scoured the California school system and identified roughly 1,500 children who scored over 135 on his IQ test. This is the top 1% of the population. Certified geniuses. He affectionately called them his termites.
He assumed these kids were going to grow up and completely rule the world.
He was absolutely certain of it. He believed he had isolated the genetic elite. His team tracked them for 60 years. They tracked their health, their marriages, their incomes, their publications.
And what was the result after 6 decades?
The termites had perfectly fine, stable, upper-middle-class lives. They became competent doctors, successful lawyers, good accountants, but 0 of them fundamentally changed the world.
0.
0 of them won a Nobel Prize. 0 became world-renowned artists or epoch-defining leaders. They were highly competent, well-paid cogs in the system, but they didn't revolutionize the system.
But here is the incredible poetic irony of Terman's study. There were 2 young boys who were evaluated by Terman's team in California, took the test, and were explicitly rejected from the study because their IQ scores weren't high enough to meet the 135 cutoff.
Yeah.
The test said they weren't smart enough to be exceptional. Their names were William Shockley and Luis Alvarez. What happened to the 2 rejects?
Both of them went on to win Nobel Prizes in physics. William Shockley co-invented the transistor, fundamentally birthing the modern digital age and Silicon Valley. Luis Alvarez did groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting work in particle physics and helped discover the iridium layer that proved the asteroid impact theory for dinosaur extinction.
That's amazing.
The 2 boys, who were objectively told by the supreme metric of the age that their intelligence was insufficient, went on to alter the trajectory of human history.
And then there's the famous example of Richard Feynman, arguably one of the greatest, most intuitive physicists of the 20th century.
Yeah.
He solved quantum electrodynamics, a historical, generational genius. His recorded IQ in high school was somewhere around 120 or 125.
Right.
A solid score, but not a genius by Terman's strict metric.
Exactly. And when you zoom out and look at massive macroeconomic studies today, IQ only explains about 4 to 5% of the variation in human income and success. It is a terrible predictor of ultimate world-shaping impact.
So why is that? Why doesn't an IQ of 160 guarantee you will outperform or out-earn or out-innovate someone with an IQ of 120? What is happening in the brain?
It comes down to what cognitive psychologists call the 120-125 plateau. Neurobiologically, around an IQ of 120, the cognitive advantage of pure processing speed flatlines.
How does that work?
Remember earlier we talked about the frontoparietal network and working memory capacity? We established that working memory essentially caps out at about 4 variables for the healthy human brain.
Yes, the 4 chumps.
Once your processing speed is fast enough to handle those 4 variables fluidly, which happens around an IQ of a 120, being able to process them slightly faster doesn't yield exponential real-world results.
So past that threshold of 120, if speed doesn't matter, what does?
After an IQ of 120, the defining question of your life is no longer how fast you think, but what you are pointing your intellect at. IQ is just raw processing speed. Think of it like a firearm. IQ is the